So today I want to do something I haven't done in a while and cover a video from Prager University. The video in question is on the topic of critical race theory and is presented by James Lindsay, founder of New Discourses. Now, before I go into the video itself, I wanted to provide some context by exploring how New Discourses describes itself as an organization, and to provide some of the basic tenets of critical race theory so we can go into this video much more informed. So with that said, let's take some time to see how New Discourses describes themselves on their About page. New Discourses is by design meant to be apolitical in the usual sense. It is in this regard only broadly liberal in the philosophical and ethical stance. It is to be a place, New Discourses, that is, to be a place where dialogue is possible and encouraged, regardless of differences in politics, aiming to be responsible with our speech and thought, while not feeling fettered by restrictions of political correctness in any of its myriad manifestations. So within that, there's a lot to actually unpack. First and foremost, whenever someone defines themselves or their organization as apolitical, they are by definition representing themselves as outside of the normal discourse of politics. They're not liberal, they're not conservative, they're not in any way left or right. They are in fact outside of that paradigm, and therefore describing some sort of universal sense of truth, something that makes sense. And by defining it in that way and providing the idea that they have dialogue that is able to have difference in political perspectives, they seem as though they are describing something universal. And the desire is to create that effect, that their perspective is indeed universal. However, within that understanding of trying to be apolitical, in most cases, and I believe in this one as well, what's actually happening here is that the liberal perspective that you can have multiple opinions and ideas is coming into contradiction with this universality. And therefore, the idea of something like political correctness, which at the end of the day is basically about treating other people with respect and calling them what they'd like to be called and treating them with dignity in the way that they'd like to be treated with dignity, is somehow something that prevents the idea of free speech. And therefore, by providing this perspective, they are revealing that they are not indeed apolitical in any way, shape, or form, and in fact are speaking out against a movement that is highly political, and in doing so, being political themselves. The website goes on to describe New Discourses as followed. Here at New Discourses, we are, as you'll find, particularly concerned with the current attempt by the movement, sometimes called critical social justice, to control the discourse of our society. So now it's positioned itself as protecting a status quo, as protecting something different, something it's trying to conserve and therefore protect. But it's already provided the guise that it's apolitical. And in trying to conserve a certain view of society, it is taking a very conservative stance. But it's done it in a way that defines it, again, as apolitical. And so in all of this, we have, this idea of critical social justice that's trying to control the narrative of our society, but this organization isn't, according to its own understanding. But again, in trying to protect itself and protect the society, it is trying to establish its own discourse. Many don't realize, however, that it also does this through having changed the meanings of many words themselves, so that they speak almost an alternate version of whatever language they are speaking. If you change the meaning of words as it happens, you can change the discourses that arise from those words. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward, because their perspective of changing words ends up becoming contradictory to a lot of the perspective that they're going to have in that video, where the idea of what critical race theory defines itself as and how it manifests is actually not at all how this person chooses to define it in order to strawman it in their argument and position. So if we go in and want to explore what critical race theory is, there's a wonderful book by the name of Critical Race Theory, An Introduction, that's written by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic, and in this book, the two of them outline a lot of the basic tenets of critical race theory. But in the interest of time, there is a section in the introduction that I want to share the majority of to go over more or less the 5 points that make up the basic tenets of critical race theory, so we can go into it well informed. So what do critical race theorists believe? probably not every member would subscribe to every tenet set out in this book. So that's something worth mentioning. Critical race theory is not a monolith. It's not a singular idea. It is a philosophy that's being explored from different perspectives as we try to analyze and come up to a consensus of what race looks like in our society. It is an exploration of the things that already exist, and therefore people are going to have slightly different variations and perspectives on it. Far from being this overwhelming, single ideology, it's a movement of ideologies and perspectives from different philosophers and academics and lawyers and so many more people. So it's a constantly evolving understanding of race and racism as it comes in contact with the society. So first and foremost, it understands that racism is not is rather ordinary. It is absolutely ordinary and occurs every day. It's not aberrational. The usual way society does business, you might say. The common everyday experience of most people of color in the country. Second, most would agree that our system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material. And in this case, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, psychic is referring to of the psyche, not like the psychic medium understanding. Now, the first feature that was described has this idea of ordinariness, that it's part of the society already and exists, and it's part of everyday life and interaction. And the understanding of a universalism, colorblindness, or formal conceptions of equality only deal with the most blatant forms of discrimination. The idea is that if you have a universal concept, you might see things that appear more obviously. Things like, a mortgage being redlined, or a black PhD not being hired compared to, say, a white high school dropout. These might be more obvious aspects, but less obvious aspects of this exist and occur in daily interactions and occur in systemic ways that, again, are not very obvious, but have been researched and have become more obvious and visible because of critical race theory itself over time. So this perspective is naturally antagonistic to the type of perspective that was put forward by the other organization, in the fact that it does not see a universality as working, but rather automatically assumes that there is a perspective that people of color experience and see that is different from what white society and the majority perspective would notice and see. And that is telling in itself on how these two perspectives disagree. And it also brings into question why it is and how it is that anybody can claim a universality if there's an entire subset of the population claiming that the reality that is seen is not seen in quite the same way by the specific group themselves. So moving forward with this, the second feature is sometimes called interest convergence or material determinism. And that adds a further dimension to things, because racism ends up not only being normal, but it actually creates an interest in white people. The white elites, those who make money off of things, get a material benefit, whereas working class whites end up getting a psychically motivated benefit, whether it be the feeling of superiority or different aspects of how the society manifests racism as favorable. And therefore, there's little incentive to notice it or eradicate it, because by doing so, you're acknowledging a certain set of advantages that you have that in a competitive system make it such that you don't want to acknowledge it or deal with it. And that's part and parcel to the issues. Now, one example that is provided that I think is absolutely fascinating is Derek Bell had come up with an understanding that Brown versus the Board of Education may not have been purely motivated by an idea of people of color getting rights or access to equal education or institutions. And the basic premise of this, while you should probably read the book to get the full analysis of this, but the basic understanding is that the Cold War played a huge factor in determining this particular shift in policy. So it wasn't necessarily all of the times the NAACP had been advocating this for years, but because it became convenient for the white majority society in terms of Cold War politics against the Soviet Union to change this particular narrative, that is when it shifted. Which actually brings us very well into the third point and fourth points. That the third point is that this is socially constructed. If you've ever heard the phrase race is a social construct, that comes from critical race theory and has a long standing in the history of how we analyze race. It's not something fixed, it's not something inherent, it's not biological, but it is rather a social categorization that is created to create certain narratives and perspectives. And all that is happening here is not the creation of those narratives, but the analysis of those narratives. And this brings us to the fourth point, which is the idea of differential racialization and its many consequences, which basically says that the dominant perspectives in society racialize different groups in different ways at different times. An example could be the idea of Japanese citizens. This is one of the cited examples, being relocated at one time into basically war camps, whereas at other times they were seen as the primary workers in agricultural sectors. You also get popular images and stereotypes of various minority groups shifting, such as people of color being, quote, happy-go-lucky, simple-minded, and content to serve white folks, but a while later the conditions change and that very group may appear in other different ways as menacing, brutish, and out of control. So this narrative is that the society will change the stereotypes as it's necessary. And that's kind of what's argued for within the idea of Brown versus Board of Education, that because of the Cold War politic, it became a change in narrative for people of color to create a different definition and understanding of equality to counter the Soviet Union's positions and perspectives, especially as Black soldiers had come back from World War II. So the last point worth going over within the basic tenets is that each race, one more point after that. Each race has its own origins and ever-evolving history. That is the notion of intersectionality and anti-essentialism. So basically, in that whole notion of different racializations, you have the idea of intersectionality, the idea that you can be multiracial or have multiple different backgrounds, and that it can create a complex and nuanced web of understandings that influence and inform your daily life and the systemic issues around your existence. Furthermore, anti-essentialism again advocates for the fact that none of this is essential and innate characteristics. Race changes over time and evolves in different ways and understandings. So you can have a person not being necessarily a monolith or a representation of a race itself. And in a slightly contradictory tone, the actual last element is that there is, by definition, a unique voice of color. And this is the larger narrative and understanding when we bring all these narratives together that creates something that is broad. And it somewhat has an uneasy tension with the idea of anti-essentialism, but not necessarily. Because anti-essentialism basically says race can change over time based on the idea of the broad perspectives of the society. But within those narratives, during specific time periods, there are specific aspects of the society that basically are agreed upon by a great number of people of color or a great number of any specific group towards their experiences. So in that understanding, while there is a tension, they are not necessarily contradictory. The voice of color thesis holds because the different histories and experiences with oppression allow them to communicate a reality and experience that is different from white counterparts who may or may not have a know or understanding of that experience. And again, this is why it is very contradictory to this universalist apolitical understanding. So the legal storytelling movement, for example, urges Black and brown writers to recount their experiences with racism and the legal system, to apply their own unique perspectives to assess laws and how they affect people of color maybe differently from white people. And whenever we talk about critical race theory, while those are the basic tenets, we need to address the term of racism. Now, racism in this context is a systemic understanding of how certain groups are going to be given disadvantages compared to other groups. So, for example, studies show that Blacks and Latinos who seek loans, apartments, or jobs are much more apt than similarly qualified whites are rejected, often for vague or spurious reasons. So you get these situations where you could be Black and you could be way more qualified for a loan, but a white person who's less qualified for this loan might get accepted. The prison population is largely Black and brown. Chief executive officers, surgeons, and university presidents, which are all revered in society, happen to be largely white. Poverty has a Black and brown face, where Black families have on the average about 1/10 of the assets of their white counterparts. Even though the mainstream understanding of conservatism likes to point to specific Black people who may have more wealth, maybe NBA players or music artists, but the generality of the society is that Black families do have 1/10 of the assets of white counterparts on average. They pay more for many products and services, including cars. Things that have to be negotiated or haggled oftentimes are more expensive, and in many areas, you get situations where fruits and vegetables and certain foods, as well as other products and services, can be more costly. And it's these little nuanced aspects that might slip under the radar that is what we're talking about in terms of analyzing critical race theory and how racism applies. People of color lead shorter lives. They receive worse medical care. They complete fewer years of school and occupy more menial jobs than white people do. And so that's the basic idea of what critical race theory is and how racism applies in it. It's not supposed to be, oh, well, this particular person is absolutely racist, but it's an analysis of systems and understandings and perspectives. And so we should keep that in mind as we go into this Prager University video. So with that said, let's actually take the time to go into the video itself. So I'm going to start it over from the beginning so we can get the full analysis of it. I'll just pop in my headphones super quick. And here we are.
Have you heard about critical race theory?
I'm
guessing you probably have. It has already insinuated itself into many institutions and is making rapid progress into others. If it takes hold, it will completely change the very nature of America and the way you live.
So the problem already is that it's describing the perspective of America changing simply because of the way you live. There's something inherent in this perspective. People of color being able to identify the way racism affects them is not a flipping of the script in America. It is an acknowledgement of what America already is and how it exists for a specific group of people. And therefore, the idea of America being flipped on its head only applies to one group, white people, the majority group in this case. Any majority group would be a factor here. So we've already determined now that he is speaking specifically to a white audience and is going to provide a white perspective on critical race theory. And in this case, because he's describing himself as universal, he is actually doing exactly what critical race theory is hoping to accomplish by pointing out that whiteness is the universal perspective, and that's not necessarily true, and that there are other perspectives out there. So he is falling into the same understanding and thus is being subject to part of the issues that come up in critical race theory and how they need to be addressed and talked about.
Critical race theory holds that the most important thing about you is your race. The color of your skin, that's who you are. Not your behavior, not your values, not your environment. Your race. In critical race...
So remember when I pointed out about changing words and definitions and how we define things? Critical race theory did not mention in any of its original language, in any of the things that we saw, any of that information that race is absolutely the most important part of your life. It didn't do that. This is a straw manning of that particular perspective. And because he is able to maneuver that and say that it's making it all about race and it's the most important factor, he's able to control that narrative. But he's changing the definition of critical race theory within this piece itself. Because the fact is, critical race theory even mentions it has a connection to intersectionality. It talks about that as a key tenet of it, which means you're also dealing with issues of sexism. You're also dealing with different cultural backgrounds and ethnical backgrounds. And so it's not just this monolith where race is the only factor. And it's clearly not that. And by redefining that, he has changed it into something that sounds a lot more menacing than what it actually is.
Race theory, if you are a member of a minoritized racial group, their term, not mine.
I don't even know how to respond to that, honestly. I mean, it's a minority racial group. Like, that's, what is he getting at with, it's not my words?
You are a victim of a system that is rigged against you, a system that doesn't want you to succeed.
So right here, he's already provided now a new narrative, which uses the word victim. The word victim implies that you are helpless in the situation. And so there's an appeal there to say, you're not helpless in this system. And people aren't. That's why they're identifying the problems and issues that are inherent. The idea isn't necessarily even to say anything about success, but rather that the odds are stacked against people of color, that there are systemic issues written and codified into law, written and codified into social interactions that make it much more difficult for people of color to succeed. Acknowledging that is not the same as making someone a victim, and that is an important distinction that needs to be mentioned. And so he himself is again redefining the understanding of critical race theory, something he claims that his organization is not about.
On the other hand, if your race is privileged, you're an exploiter, whether you intend to be or not.
We never actually got into the perspective of being part of the majority group in that understanding of critical race theory. As a matter of fact, critical race theory, by definition, is trying to rid ourselves of that white analysis and understanding. So the emphasis isn't put on the white person or the majority group as necessarily the exploiter, but it's rather dealing with the actual consequences of how a white society influences people of color. And therefore, it's providing a certain narrative that talks about the perspectives that people of color experience. So by putting the word exploiter, you are, again, putting another buzzword out there that makes it seem as though it's scarier than what it is. It's about, if you're in the majority group, your goal in critical race theory is to examine it and to try to analyze yourself within that perspective as the majority. In what ways you are not necessarily, going against the grain by keeping the status quo in a certain way. In what ways are you biased?
Critical race theory begins from the assumption that racism occurs in all interactions. To see how this works, consider this thought experiment. Imagine you own a shop and two customers enter at the same time.
So I just need to point out that when we're looking at this model where two customers are walking into the shop, we've already codified that this entire perspective is from a white perspective. So we've already now codified this entire piece white because he's speaking to a white audience. Because that's the only group that America would have flipped on its head. So now it's a white shop owner with two customers walking in, and it's the white person who has to make this decision as business owner. And these things are subtle and written under the language here. Now, we can sit there and question, if we actually questioned him, would he say that and admit to it? No, but really, who is he addressing and speaking to within this narrative?
One white and one black. Who do you help first? If you help the black person first, critical race theory would say you did so because you don't trust black people to be left alone in your store. That's racist. If you help the white person first instead, critical race theory would say you did so because you think blacks are second-class citizens. That's racist too. That's critical race theory.
So what he's tried to say critical race theory is there is that it's a set of contradictions that are defined by trying to blame people and be racist. Did you see the word racism pop up in any of the basic tenets or definitions of critical race theory? No, because that's not the point. The point isn't necessarily to say, oh, this is racist. It's to identify a specific set of things, a specific way in which white society interacts with people of color. And yes, there are aspects of racism written into this because that's the way the institutions function. They function in a way that is racist. And in this narrative, there's a lot of issues. First and foremost, it's being examined from a white perspective, which is kind of counterintuitive to critical race theory itself. Second of all, this idea of being worried about being racist between these two different narratives is kind of a manifestation of white guilt, really. It's a manifestation of, well, I don't want to be racist. That's the worst thing I can be called. But that's not the point. The point is to sit there and question the societal understandings, and for a person in that position to be sitting there saying, am I doing this? Is this something I am unconsciously doing? And to explore oneself and perspective to move into a more anti-racist perspective. It's not specifically designed to be this like gotcha where you're going to be racist no matter what, which makes you the villain and the bad guy all the time. That's not the point. Within the interactions we have, within our own experiences, within our own psyches, there are ingrained understandings of certain racial hierarchies and perspectives and opinions, and it's on us to analyze those and start to deconstruct them. And the only way we can do that is by identifying what's there already. Now, to make this narrative a little bit more damning, the New Discourses website actually has this as one of their examples in an article. And I want to read to you a section from that article. It's the same exact premise. That is, as you imagine yourself coming out from behind the counter to greet one or the other of these two customers, one white, one black, racism is present in your decision. If anyone involved accepts the tenets of critical race theory, it'll be that person's job to identify your racism and make a stink of it. Which might result, if you're in certain American cities today, in your shop being vandalized, looted, and burned down in the coming nights. In some sense, everything in your life hinges upon you making the right decision in a situation that doesn't allow for such a thing. So in this narrative, there's so much wrong here. There's clearly a reference to the idea of people of color, the exact same thing that we described in critical race theory, being made to be simultaneously the victim in one part of this narrative, which is earlier in the video, but in this particular case, they're the people who might come out and vandalize and loot and burn your place down in the coming nights, because you were racist, because you were bad, and it flips the script and makes it about white people as opposed to people of color. Furthermore, the idea that it's a gotcha and that it's not, there's no right answer isn't the point. It's to identify this perspective that can change and be varying. And it speaks to this particular person's defensiveness, that they can't analyze themselves and analyze the situation beyond the idea of, I don't want to be racist, that's bad, it's a gotcha. So let's get back to the video.
It can find racism in anything, even if it has to read your mind to do it. Critical race theory is a uniquely American invention. Brewed up at Harvard Law School in the 70s, now part of the academic and media mainstream, it is also uniquely un-American.
I love these buzzwords. It's part of the mainstream media, with the microphones showing up on screen. It's un-American. Even though it was created in America by African Americans, it is un-American. So now we've equated a theory from African American people as un-American. Furthermore, the fact that it happened at Harvard, at this large institution, which Prager University often has an issue with academia, there's kind of a hit piece aspect to it there. And it ends up creating a very disingenuous perspective where they are not operating in any sort of good faith in this regard.
Because it rejects the core tenets of the American classically liberal Judeo-Christian value system.
Apolitical, everyone. Core tenets of the American classically liberal Judeo-Christian value system. Apolitical. At this point, there's no justification for this perspective. this is clearly a political bias and understanding. So we need to take it as such. And if this perspective is in a counterpoint to what critical race theory is defining, then critical race theory is actually the thing describing the multiple aspects and is honestly operating in much more good faith, even if we look at this at a argument to argument perspective and ignore the fact that this is really just a white person denying the fact that racism exists. But yeah, by describing themselves as apolitical but holding a Judeo-Christian value system, there's an inherent contradiction there. Because Judeo-Christian values are themselves a political ideology.
It turns the bedrock American idea upside down. Here it is in the words of Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk, two leading proponents. Critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and the neutral principles of constitutional law.
So this quote, I didn't go over it before because I knew he was going to go over it. This is from the introduction. And as you can hopefully see at this point, the neutral principles of constitutional law are valid to call into question when you have issues dating back to like Brown versus Board of Education, but even in the prison pipeline and some of the other aspects that we've talked about on whether or not laws are applied equally. And we know that a lot of them aren't. They are enforced differently. Judges respond differently. There's an actual pipeline for people of color that is much more pronounced and obvious than for white people that is influenced by systemic racism. These are known facts. They are well established. And so, yeah, there is a good idea to question this apolitical liberal understanding of everything being equal and there being a universal perspective, because it isn't true. And in that enlightened rationalism, that idea that we can come to a singular understanding is being called into question, and this video is further evidence for critical race theory being necessary.
It does this because critical race theory proponents assume racism is present everywhere and always, and they look for it critically until they find it.
So the assumption there is it doesn't exist until they find it, when in reality, they are discovering something that already exists and putting words to it that a lot of people have experienced already. They are not just making it up on the fly. And I think that should be evident based on the statistics on what we can show and we can evaluate over time. If you don't necessarily adhere to the sections of the book, I implore you to look up the statistics yourself and see just how much of that is true.
And they always find it. It has to be there because that's how the imperial European powers and then America set things up.
I mean, yeah, that's what colonialism is. That's what imperialism is. You go into a territory and you literally change the culture and change things to your perspective. You get rid of traditions and history, and you exploit people economically by setting up systems in which you extract wealth. That's the definition of imperialism. Of course, that's racist. Like, I don't even know what he's defending there.
Here, as in all dangerous academic theories,
dangerous academic theory, the idea that all perspectives and liberal perspectives are all valid, except this is a dangerous academic theory. This is going to turn America upside down. The language here is very inflammatory.
There is a kernel of truth. Human beings were not preoccupied with race until the 16th century, when Europeans began to explore and then colonize other parts of the world. Drawing distinctions between the races reached its peak in the 19th century with the widespread use of slave labor in North and South America. No one denies this. But since then, the Western world, and most especially America, has spent a lot of time, money, and blood breaking free of its racist past. It's been a rocky road for sure, but great progress has been made. Critical race theory says all this progress is a mirage. Racism never died, never even faded a little bit. It just hid itself better.
So, here's the thing. The idea that it hid itself better is not the idea that it didn't change, it didn't morph, or that it didn't get better. In fact, we're not even analyzing better or worse. As you saw within the definitions, there's just an understanding that it changed. It took a new shape, one that was less visible, and that it would be a more accurate assessment than what he is prescribing here, that it's this idea that, it never got better. Is anybody going to argue that the current system and slavery are necessarily completely 100% compatible? No, but are there aspects of the original slave system that have transformed and still influence today's world? Or are there ideas in which the fact that slavery existed have influenced the economic conditions of people today? Yeah, that's true. And so there's a huge difference between what he just said and that analysis.
Critical race theory, therefore, is not a continuation of the civil rights movement. It is, in fact, a repudiation of it. To critical race theorists, Martin Luther King was both wrong and naive. White Americans can never judge blacks by the content of their character. They can only judge them, always unfavorably, consciously or unconsciously, by the color of their skin.
So there's a lot to unpack with what was just said. Again, the usage of the civil rights movement as if this person and their universalist perspective is somehow a representation of the civil rights and that we're going to claim that history, when a lot of what we see in BLM and a lot of what we see in the civil rights movement about how this isn't the time, this isn't the way, this isn't how you do it, riots are bad, all this other stuff. It's kind of the same thing. And what's being done here is Martin Luther King is being weaponized by white people against people of color. When King would probably agree, I think it's safe to say that he would agree with most of the ideas of critical race theory. Critical race theory, even though we have a name for it now, and it's been developed more in depth since the 1970s, a lot of the ideas and basic premises go back to W.E.B. Du Bois, and how he analyzed his own understanding of the United States. This is not something new coming out of nowhere. This is something that has existed and been manifested for a long time. King was a socialist. King was somebody who wanted to create a society, yes, where there was, egalitarian principles and understandings, but he also acknowledged the racism inherent in different aspects of the system, how it economically influenced things. He called for reparations, and those were never given out. There was a lot under that. And I'm a little bit sick and tired of King being weaponized against people of color in this way, because it's a complete misrepresentation of what the civil rights movement was. Oh, well, we just wanted equality and everything to be better. No, there was a desire for justice. And justice was not served. And it has not been served. Reparations have not been given out. There hasn't been an addressment of the financial issues around those things. And again, the law has been changed and recodified in such a way as to perpetuate the same systems. And we see that within the voting rights laws that are being passed. We see that in a lot of the different laws that are being passed, especially in the South, but across the United States. We still don't have justice. There's still a different law between black people and white people. And it's seen within all the way from the police interaction, all the way through the courts.
Ironically, not since the Aryan obsession in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, or South African apartheid in the second half of the 20th century, has a social movement been so obsessed with race.
What this is essentially saying is, we're not the racist, you're the racist. Also, I just need to say, going back to that other perspective, nobody today would be saying King was naive or anything like that by trying to create a more just society. He was addressing a lot of the same issues, as was the numerous other civil rights leaders, because others exist. Take a look at Dorothy Heights. Take a look at anybody else from that era. It doesn't need to be exclusively Martin Luther King. There's just a fixation to use him as a tool of the system that he tried to fix, that he tried to make better in certain ways. In his attempts to deal with systemic racism, he got subverted into it and is now being used as a tool by that very same system and understanding to perpetuate a white narrative over the voices of people of color. Again, another piece of evidence that we need critical race theory.
Critical race theory is then, in a very real sense, a counter-American revolution. But that's a positive,
Scary
not
words.
a negative to those who subscribe to the theory. The American experiment was given a 400-year tryout, and it doesn't work. So let's scrap it. That's
Nobody
what they
said
believe. Is that what you believe?
Again, that's definitions. That's what they believe. Is that what you believe? They being critical race theorists, they being people of color, you being the white person. And even if you are a person of color watching this, they're trying to play you on that narrative of victimhood, which you'll see in a second.
I'm going to guess that most of you don't. So how do we stop critical race theory before it infects the brains of too many decent Americans, especially young people, and turns us into something we have never been and shouldn't ever want to be? The answer is simple. Refuse to accept it. Don't be intimidated by the heads I win, tails you lose logic of this self-destructive, America-hating, anti-reality idea.
Ooh, more scary
Don't
words.
be bullied into thinking that you're
not political, by the way.
Racist when you know you're not, or that you're a victim when you know you're not.
You know you're not racist, therefore you're not racist. You know you're not a victim, therefore you shouldn't just subscribe to critical race theory. That's all this is advocating for. And the reality is, we all have biases. We all have grown up in a society that creates certain narratives and stories. We all have certain things internalized. And that's going to manifest in different ways, in different interactions. And it's going to take time and the usage of anti-racism to start to critically analyze ourselves and move ourselves past those perspectives. And so it's, again, not about victimhood. It's about acknowledging what's already there and the barriers to a just society. It's about acknowledging the fact that the system, since its inception, has been built on one that perpetuates the idea of racism. And that if we're going to overturn it, we need something a little bit more radical and to change it, to address these wounds. We need to address the wounds that have been here for 400 years. That doesn't mean necessarily scrapping the American perspective. It means growing and changing and developing new ideas that can circumvent this by acknowledging the ills of the society that we live in. And again, that's not supposed to be a gotcha. That's supposed to be an analysis of how we can better ourselves. But if you've already come in with the perspective that America's perfect and that there's a universal truth that you've already reached, you have no opportunity to grow.
Defend yourself while you still can.
Ooh.
I'm James Lindsay, founder of New Discourses for Prager University.
That is the ultimate scary words. Defend yourself while you still can, because they're coming for you. If you have any question in your mind about who they're addressing and why they're addressing this particular perspective, that's what they're worried about. There's a fear that they're going to lose their property, their status, and their wealth. And it is inherent in that understanding and perspective that they're going to lose some sort of status or symbol, something that they own. There's something that they control, which is whiteness at the end of the day. And by losing that power, they feel like they're losing a societal position, and that therefore equality to them, to white populations, including myself in all of this, as a light-skinned person who's experienced a lot of privileges from my skin color, that is a narrative and perspective where critical race theory ends up analyzing it and addressing a lot of the issues. This person's defensiveness is part and parcel to why we need critical race theory and why it's important. And acknowledging the benefits and the things that we get from the system, acknowledging those aspects is not an equation to, be a gotcha or to hurt you. That's not the point of all this. If you're a white person watching this, that's not the point. It is to emphasize the voices of people of color and to make sure that their narrative is understood so that we can start to move towards something resembling justice. Because we're not there yet, and we won't be for a while, especially with videos like this one. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.